Hello, my name is Pierozzi, and today we're going to be discussing texture as an element of 3D design. So, what we'd like to break texture down into three categories when we really start to think about it. One is the natural texture, two is work texture, and three is visual texture. So, let's get into each one of these a little bit further. What's texture? Why don't we just start with what texture is, right? It's the tactile surface characteristic of a work of art that is either felt or perceived visually, okay? So think about that, how something may really feel. Is it going to feel soft? Is it going to cut me like broken glass? Those are things that you might want to think about. The texture of a work is the surface characteristics we could feel if we could touch it. Its hardness, its softness, bumpiness, smoothness, sharpness, furriness, or whatever, really. When we cannot or do not touch an object, it's the impression of what it would feel like are conveyed to us visually. So again, you don't necessarily have to be touching this piece to get a sense for what this texture might feel like. If you're going to take your hand and run it across a sharp piece of sandpaper, you're going to kind of know what that texture is going to feel like. So let's take a look at this piece. When we look at it, we get this sort of sense of what texture feels. There's like a juxtaposition of these two textures, right? So if we look at this side, that's going to feel really nice and smooth and probably very good to the sense of touch. But on this side, not so much, right? That's going to feel like it may hurt your hands, and you're not really going to want to run your hands across that particular piece. But again, we can get a lot of information just by visually taking a look at it. Let's talk about natural texture at first. Okay, so what is natural texture? Artists often find it suits their purpose to use the material exactly as it comes from nature. Okay, so think about that. Artists often find it suitable their purposes to use materials exactly as they come from nature. So this is, again, I love showing Walter Di Maria's pieces. This is a great example of it. He's using texture, and he found it. It hasn't really changed it at all. But there's sort of this contrasting of the soft, granular textures of the dirt with the hard, smooth texture of the wall, right? So again, hasn't altered the material at all, just sort of put it in place. And lo and behold, you have the sort of natural texture here. And here's a separate view. You got a little bit of plexiglass to give a sense of depth. Obviously, you're not going to want to walk into this room. I mean, I guess you can, but probably not going to be the best experience for you. But it's really, you're meant to experience it right here, right? Sometimes natural textures are used not to call attention to their own identity, but rather to refer to other similar textures. In this work, the artist conveyed the same texture of human skin by using shells. So if we look at this, we're not altering this material, right? We're not cutting it, we're not carving into it, we're not tearing it. We might be gluing it to a frame and using it, but this is really not changing the natural material at all. Simply using shells, you get a sense of that texture. Imagine your hand sort of running across this person's hair, okay? That might not feel very comfortable. Usually we must be familiar with the texture of both the natural material being used and the texture it's representing to appreciate such pieces fully. So if we look at this, again, we're not changing these rocks at all, right? We're just sort of gluing it on a frame. And what's interesting about this is actually a person. This is kind of a mask. So it becomes participatory sculpture. A person is using it. It's also personal interaction. You're wearing it. But again, we're not really alternating it. It's perceived as you would normally find it in nature, although it's been rearranged in such a way that it comes off as an artistic piece, right? Sometimes many textures that we consider natural have already been worked to a certain extent. We think of art pieces as wood or natural surfaces, but it's already a step removed from the initial bark surface of its origin, the tree. So when we take a look at this, we really get a sense that it's a tree, right? That has this sort of um, real natural material, but it's been really worked over quite a bit to create this interesting surface and texture. And it is removed from what a tree really looks like, although you may not be completely aware of that. Certain pieces seem to offer a single natural texture for our exploration, yet a subtle form of contrast or variation is often presented to engage our awareness. Okay, so if we take a look at this, we may read this as one texture, but there's really a lot going on with Sheila Hicks's piece. We've got these types of lines in combination with sort of this. Looks very simple, but it's not. It's complicated. It's got a lot of different textures, got a lot of different materials that are being used. This work appears as one piece of string, but after looking at it more closely, it's made up of many different types. Silk, all right, there's things that are thick and thin and curly and colored, etc. So let's talk a little bit about work surface, which we've already kind of talked to a little bit about, right? But let's give you a definition of that. The surface of a material may be manipulated or worked by the artist to create a variety of textural effects. Examples could be carved, blasted, polished, grounded, hammered, built up, etc. To shape the materials to desired form and simulate the texture of an actual three-dimensional object. So what do we mean by texture? Worked. This is a good example of this, right? So we take a look at this. It sort of appears in its natural state, but it's not. It has changed the surface of the wood to create great variety. All right, we know what variety means now of textured surfaces. So we have this smoothness here, we have the bumpiness here, we have this face feature that has some ridges on it. And this is sort of, look at the hands, how they're just kind of burnt in there. And you don't even realize that, that becomes a real two-dimensional object there. We take a look at this. The artist has carved the wooden to be like the body of humans. These objects are about being less about wood and more like the object that's being rendered. So in this particular case, the artist is really just using wood as the material and not vice versa. They're using it to create human figure, and it's really about the human figure, right? It's less about the material. Some of the other pieces we showed you earlier, this is kind of about the material, right? Even take a look at this. So while we saw representational, figurative pieces, this is non-representational, right? Even in non-objective work or non-representational, texture manipulation can be used only to shape form, but also to emphasize it. These chisel grooves are an important part of this piece and part of the process. Okay, so working with hammer and chisel, that was a really important element within this piece, and tools that really associate with carving of wood. This has very little. It has some reference to wood, but again, it's really kind of removed as a piece of wood. But we've got this really textured surface. Makes for a very, very interesting piece. I just love that. It almost feels like it's ocean waves, or this feels like almost how a tractor's half-track tractor tires are, right? Rather than emphasizing form, texture sometimes may be used to deny it, right? From the distance, Land Rovers appear as a series of 14 cedar longs on the edge of a hill. But once we come closer, deep gashes, slashes, and chiseled surfaces into the wood draw attention away from the whole form and into their scarred surfaces. if you ever get a chance to take a look at her, she's, has a really interesting history coming from Europe in the 1940s and talking about her childhood, and I think her dad being put in a slave labor camp. And her artwork is about that sort of scarification of surfaces, and so we can kind of see that on this on these branches. This is almost like a set of railroad tracks, right? Do we notice the repetition of these as well? Okay, here's another one of her pieces. Again, really interesting textured surfaces. Play a huge part. These are actually very, very large pieces, so scale also plays an important part. Now look at the contrast here. So textures may also be manipulated to provide contrast, either within a work or between the work and its surroundings. So if we take a look at this, this is actually clay. I believe this is Adrian Sachs's piece. But look at the juxtaposition of these two surfaces, or contrast, we'd like to say. So here we have this really, coarse, rough texture you may not want to touch. Even the darkness of the color. And then over here we have this silver smooth surface. You don't mind running your hand across this. You might not want to run your hands across this, right? So again, we have this visual texture that's present. We also have texture right up here. So we've got this texture, smooth texture, and then this, all within the same piece. It's a great way to really create a beautiful contrast and really draw the viewer into a piece such as this. Let's talk about visual texture. What is visual texture? Many works present an optically perceived visual texture that does not correspond with the actual texture of the material. So let's say that again. So visual texture. Many works present an optically perceived visual texture that does not correspond with the actual texture of the material. Well, what does that mean? Well, let's take a look at this piece. I mean, this was done a long time ago. This is a stone carving. It's designed to look like a softer texture, right? Now, I think it's out of marble, but if we feel this, we're going to feel the drapery, right? Visually, we're going to think about how, closed drapes and how soft they are. But if we actually felt this material, it's not going to feel anything like that, right? It's going to be very permanent, like touching rock. It may be smooth, but it's not going to feel soft. This is interesting. So visual textures may be used not only to capture the likeness of an object, but it can be used to create an optical illusion designed to amaze the viewer with their clever simulation of actual textures. So this is known as trompe-l'oeil, which is a French term, which means fool the eye. So if we take a look at this, we're thinking about, this is a normal pair of boots, right? But it's not. It's actually made out of clay, and it's very stiff and rigid, and it's not going to go anyplace. And if you throw a pair of boots on the floor, they're probably not going to break into 1,000 pieces. In this particular case, it's going to break into 1,000 pieces. But yeah, that's actually clay. You could do a lot with that material. Can you guess this leather bag? What this material is? It's also not soft. It's clay. It's Marion Levine's briefcase. I got an opportunity to see a lot of her work over the years, and to be honest, they look exactly like leather. And they can totally play with what you see that. So again, I'm not going to be able to push this in. I'm not going to be able to push that in. I'm going to break this piece. Visual texture can also be used to create more visual pleasing object. So here I think we have a coffee grinder of like the late 1800s, if I remember correctly. Can be completely wrong. But look at all the visual textures that's set up on this. Look at the surface of this, the smoothness of this. All right, this adds a little extra elements to make that visually pleasing. And you can throw your ad right here as well, right? Ooh, isn't that beautiful? How would you like to play with that typewriter? So the texture of this, all right, these in some ways have smooth texture as well, but visually you can feel that. I mean, it's just a beautiful, pleasing thing that takes a normal, everyday, mundane typewriter and making it into something a little bit more exciting, a little something more that you'd feel really good about. Okay, so I hope you liked the presentation on texture. Thanks for watching my PowerPoint. Again, I'm Lou Pierozzi, and I hope you have a really great day. I hope you enjoyed and learned a lot about texture.